On the morning of October 9th, 1967, a man sat on a dirt floor in a one-room schoolhouse in a village so small it barely appeared on maps. His name was Ernesto Guevara, the man the world would come to know simply as Chi. He was 39 years old, his hands were bound, his boots had been taken. He had a bullet wound in his leg from the ambush the day before. Outside, the Bolivian army was deciding what to do with him. Inside, a school teacher named Julia Cotres bought him food. He refused it and simply asked her to take care of his men instead. In Washington, it was late evening. The cables had already arrived. The CIA had what it had been spending hundreds of millions of dollars and 11 years trying to get. The order came back within hours. Don't bring him out alive. A sergeant named Mario Terran drew the assignment. He walked into the room. By his own account, he couldn't look at Guevara in the eye. He walked back out. He stood in the corridor and composed himself. He went back in. Guevara looked at him and said, "Shoot, coward, you're only going to kill a man." Terrain fired 9 shots. Within 48 hours, photographs of the body were on the front pages of newspapers across 6 different continents. Within 12 months, his face was on the walls of universities in Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, and New York. Within 30 years, it had become the most reproduced photograph in the history of human communication. The CIA had just created the very thing they were actually trying to stop. But to understand what really happened and why it was almost inevitable, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the revolution, earlier than that, to a motorcycle and a young doctor and a road through South America that went on to change absolutely everything. Ernesto Guevara was born in 1928 in Rosario, Argentina, into a family that was educated, politically aware, and comfortably middle class. His father was an architect. His mother filled the house with books on Marx, Engels, and Latin American history books. He was a sickly child, severe asthma from age 2, which would follow him for the rest of his life, including in the jungles of Bolivia, where it would eventually help bring him down. Despite it, he was relentlessly physical. He played rugby, he climbed mountains, he refused to be defined by what his lungs could or could not do. He trained as a medical doctor and he was by every single sign heading toward a respectable professional life. Then, in January 1952, at 23 years old, he and a friend got an old Norton 500cc motorcycle they called La Perdosa, the mighty one, and began riding north. The motorcycle broke down after a few weeks. They hitchhiked, walked, and talked their way onto boats. The journey took 8 months and covered most of South America. And what Guevara saw during those 8 months was a continent which was systematically being dismantled and taken apart. In Chile, he visited the Chiquimata, the copper mine, which is one of the world's largest open pit copper mines, owned by an American corporation. Think of it as a tech company that owns the entire country's infrastructure, the housing, the food supply, and the local government. And the workers have actually no way out. Indigenous workers descended into the mine before dawn and came up after dark, paid in company script that could be only spent at company stores, living in company towns they couldn't leave without the company's permission. He wrote in his diary, "The copper is American, the land is American, the men are rented." In Peru, he spent 3 weeks working at a leap colony on the Amazon, treating patients who had been exiled there, not purely for medical reasons, but because of leprosy, because it was considered a disease for the poor and the poor were considered inconvenient. As a matter of fact, on his birthday, he swam across the Amazon River to spend the night with the patients rather than actually spending time with the doctors in the doctor's quarters. The patient went on to throw a party for him. He wrote, "I'm not the same man I was when I left Buenos Aires." By the time he returned to Argentina to complete his degree, something fundamentally had shifted. The poverty he had witnessed was not accidental, it was structural. It was the intended outcome of a system, not a failure of one. And the system was being maintained deliberately and violently by governments that own their existence to foreign money. What do you do with that diagnosis? If you're Ernesto Guevara, you spend the next 2 years looking for somewhere the patient is being treated. In 1954, he found Guatemala, where a democratically elected president had passed a Land Reform Act, which actually took unused land from American-owned plantation and redistributed it to indigenous farmers. It sounded like a reasonable policy. A democratically elected government was removed immediately within almost 6 weeks. The CIA had actually organized and founded the coup. The land reforms were cancelled, the plantations kept their land, the people who had believed held it, they were actually forced to give it back. Guevara watched the whole thing happen from the streets of the Guatemala city. He was 26 years old and he had now seen with his own eyes what happened when a country in Latin America tried to change the arrangement. He moved to Mexico City and there, at a dinner party in July 1955, he met a Cuban lawyer named Fidel Castro who was planning something. Castro had been in Mexico for a year, gathering a small force of Cuban exiles with a plan to return to Cuba and overthrow the dictator Fulgencio Batista, a man who had cancelled elections, abolished political parties, and run the country as a personal operation, while American corporation controlled its sugar, its tourism, and its casinos. Castro had heard about the Argentine doctor who had been in Guatemala during the coup. He wanted to meet him. They talked throughout the night. By morning, Guevara had signed on. He later wrote, "I thought it would take an hour. It took one night. When dawn came, I was already a soldier of the revolution." In December 1956, 82 men boarded a leaking yacht called the Granama and set sail for Cuba. The crossing took 7 days in rough seas. They landed at the wrong beach 2 days later and they were almost immediately spotted by Batista's army. Within a week, 70 of the 82 were actually dead or captured. The 12 survivors, including Guevara and Castro, disappeared into the mountains of eastern Cuba. From fewer than 20 men at its lowest point, the movement rebuilt itself, recruiting from local peasants, establishing supply lines, running a clandestine radio station, and began winning engagement against a military force so exponentially larger and better equipped than them. Guevara commanded the column that took Santa Clara, Cuba's third largest city, in a battle that lasted 2 days and effectively broke Batista's military capacity. He took a city with a bulldozer and 2 Molotov cocktails. On January 1st, 1959, Batista fled the country. 2 days later, Guevara rode in to Havana. In Washington, the response was measured anxiety. Then Castro appointed Guevara head of the National Bank, a pointed choice since Guevara had no banking background whatsoever. He later joked that he was appointed because he misheard Castro's ask for an economist when he actually asked for a communist. I misheard. Within 2 years, every major American-owned business in Cuba, the sugar industry, the oil refineries, the banks had been taken back by the Cuban government. The companies that had owned these assets were among the most politically connected corporations in America. Their board of members actually included former CIA directors and State Department officials. Washington's measured anxiety became something considerably less measured. In March 1960, less than 18 months after the revolution, Eisenhower approved a classified program to train Cuban missile forces for a potential invasion. The same program authorized in a separate annex the elimination of Fidel Castro. Guevara was not on that list yet. He was about to put himself on it very, very soon. Folks, to understand why the CIA eventually spent about $400 million specifically targeting Guevara, you have to understand what he was doing between 1960 and 1965. Most revolutionary figures, when they win, consolidate. They build institutions, they become administrators. Guevara had no interest in administrating. While holding government positions in Havana, he was simultaneously traveling the world, building relationships with revolutionary movements across countries like Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In December 1964, he stood at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. He was a 36-year-old in a military fatigues, and he had just come from a meeting from Malcolm X. He spoke for about 45 minutes. He named American corporations by name. He described their operations in specific countries. He cited wage rates and working conditions. He called it not investment but colonialism with just better accounting. The speech was broadcasted across Latin America in countries where people were living inside exactly that particular system that Guevara was just describing. The effect was absolutely electric. The CIA had been tracking Guevara for 4 years, and after the UN speech, his file escalated because the CIA's central fear, the doctrine that shaped the American foreign policy since the late 1940s, was what they called the domino theory. The theory held that countries were like dominoes. If one fell for communalism, the next would follow, and the next. It's why America sent soldiers to Vietnam, not because Vietnam itself was the strategic prize, but because of what its fall was believed to mean for the rest of Southeast Asia. Guevara had read the theory and he had a counter argument. He called it the FOCO theory. The idea was that you didn't need to wait for the conditions for the revolutions to be absolutely perfect. A small, disciplined guerrilla force could create those conditions by simply existing. Its survival would demonstrate the system was invisible. Its presence would attract supporters. The revolution would generate its own momentum. Not Moscow, not Washington, a third Rome. He had proved it once in Cuba. He intended to go on to prove it every single place in the world. You don't wait for the conditions, you become the spark, and the conditions automatically go on to follow. This was not a man who was fighting for one country. This was a man who was trying to build a counter system, and the CIA knew this completely. In 1964, Guevara resigned from every position in the Cuban government. He gave up his Cuban citizenship. He left a letter for Castro to be read public only if he died, and he went on to vanish. The letter said, "Other nations of the world call for my modest efforts. I can do what is denied to you due to your responsibility as the head of Cuba." He was going to build fire somewhere else. The CIA's job was to find him before he went on to do this. Before Bolivia, there was a failure, and understanding that failure is the only way the rest of the story is actually going to make sense. The first place Guevara went after leaving Cuba was Congo. See, in 1965, the country was in the middle of a brutal civil conflict. The first democratically elected leader had been assassinated 4 years earlier in an operation that the CIA had actually planned. The man who replaced him was an American intelligence asset who ran the country as a personal fortune. A guerrilla movement was fighting him in the east. Guevara believed this was where the African Revolution could actually begin. He entered the Congo in April 1965 with approximately 100 Cuban soldiers and fighters under a false identity without telling the Congolese leadership he was coming until he arrived. The operation lasted 7 months, complete failure. The local leadership was actually fractured, supply lines collapsed, the local population in most areas reported the outsiders' movements to the army. Guevara's asthma returned severely. He went on to leave in November 1965. But what actually matters is what he went on to do next. He didn't explain it away, he didn't file a report that softened the edges. He sat down with a notebook and wrote every mistake down in his own hand. He had gone in with a theory. He had not understood the specific history, the specific social structure, the specific ways the local population understand their own situation. He had arrived with a plan, not enough knowledge of the people, and the plan was supposed to be severe. He spent months in Tanzania, Cuba, and Eastern Europe writing, recovering, and actually rebuilding. When he emerged with a new target, he had chosen Bolivia after a detailed analysis. Its political geography, its history of miners' uprisings, its position at the center of South America. He believed he had learned from Congo. What he had not accounted was, how thoroughly was the CIA spending time, money, efforts, and resources into studying him to capture the mission that he was relentlessly working on. In November 1966, Ernesto Guevara crossed into Bolivia carrying a forged Argentinian passport in the name of Adolfo Mena González. He wore glasses and a suit, right? And he shaved his beard. He had combed his hair back. A photograph from this period shows a man who looks like a mid-level bank official, someone who would, just pass through the airport without any second thought from the customs or the airport authorities. He established a base camp in a remote canyon in the Bolivian southeast. 17 Cuban fighters joined him. He expected to recruit from local peasants and from the Bolivian Communist Party, which had nominally pledged support. Both expectations collapsed almost immediately. The Communist Party withdrew under Soviet pressure. The local peasants were deeply suspicious of the outsiders in the mountains and frequently reported their movements to the army. The Congo problem again, just in a different terrain. Meanwhile, the CIA was already there. Washington had anticipated that Guevara's next operation would be in Latin America, and they certainly knew this. A Cuban double agent confirmed his presence in Bolivia. Within weeks of his arrival, the CIA stationed in the La Paz was reinforced. An agent named Felix Rodriguez, Cuban-American Bay of Pigs veteran, personally motivated to finish what he considered unfinished business, arrived to run the intelligence operations on ground. A team of United States Army Special Forces were deployed under the cover of a military training mission. The real assignment was to build and train a Bolivian Ranger battalion specifically to hunt Guevara in the terrain and from the places that he was actually operating from. Training took 4 months. By August 1967, the battalion was operational. Guevara's column by this point was actually falling apart. From a peak of 50 fighters, disease, desertion and combat had reduced them to only 17 men. Guevara's asthma had returned so severely that on some days he couldn't walk without assistance and had to hold people support to actually walk through the terrains. No medicine, no food. The courier network that was supposed to supply them had been compromised. He knew they were actually being hunted. He didn't know how close the hunters actually were. On October 7, 1967, a local farmer told the Bolivian army exactly where the column was resting. The Ranger battalion surrounded the ravine before dawn. The firefighting lasted 11 minutes. Guevara's rifle was hit by a bullet and destroyed. His leg was wounded. His ammunition was exhausted. 2 soldiers grabbed him. He said to them, "Don't shoot. I am more valuable to you alive than dead." They took him into the schoolhouse in La Higuera. Felix Rodriguez flew in by helicopter that evening. He spent the night with Guevara, photographing him, documenting his statements for Langley talking. Rodriguez later recalled that Guevara was calm and completely lucid. He spoke about his family. He asked about the fate of his fighters, the last 2 men that he discussed the economics of Latin America. At that point, Guevara said, "Tell Fidel he will soon see a triumphant revolution in America." In the morning, Rodriguez arrived at the orders from the Bolivian High Command transmitted through the CIA channels. Execute. The Bolivian government did not want a trial. A trial would give Guevara a platform. A living Guevara in a cell would be a cause. A dead Guevara, they believed, would be a closed case. Rodriguez set his watch to 1:10 p.m. Terrain fired 9 shots. The CIA sent a cable to Washington. It read, "Guevara's hand and face are in good condition." They needed the fingerprints for verification, so they cut off his hands. The Bolivian government made a decision about the body. They would display it. The thinking was logical. The reason was full of rumors that, Guevara had survived, that no army could actually capture him or no army could actually hold him. Physical proof would extinguish those rumors. It would demoralize his supporters. It would demonstrate concretely that the revolution project was completely finished. The body was laid out in the laundry room in a hospital in a town called Valle Grande. His wound and head were cleaned. His eyes were opened. His hair had been washed. Journalists were brought in from throughout the world. Press photographs were given access to. They got what they wanted and more. 7 journalists noted it independently in real time without coordination. The images resembled resonance painting of the deportation of Christ, the prone figure, the open eyes, the gathered crowd, the specific quality of the light. Art historians who later studied the photographs confirmed the visual parallel in academic papers. It was not staged, but it might have been done as well, you never know. The photograph that spread furthest was not from the hospital. It had been taken years earlier in about 1960 by a Cuban photographer named Alberto Korda at a Havana memorial service. Guevara was standing in the crowd in a beret looking slightly upward and to the left. Korda caught him for 2 seconds before he moved. He printed the image, filled it and throughout, it just spread like anything. After the October 9th, 1967, the photograph became everything. An Irish artist named Jim Fitzpatrick took Korda's photograph, converted it into a high contrast graphic of black, white, and red, and released it to the world. No copyrights, no restrictions, take it, use it forever. Within months, it was on walls across Europe, Latin America, Asia, and North America. It remains today the most reproduced photograph or image derived from a photograph in the history of human communication. Most people have seen Che Guevara's face than any other face in recorded history. The CIA was the one that actually made this possible, but the deeper miscalculation runs underneath even the photograph. The entire strategic logic of eliminating Guevara was to stop the spread of the idea that he actually represented. The ordinary people in the developing world could refuse the system built around them, could take back what they had been taken, could organize and fight and win. Killing him did not actually stop that idea. It removed the person from where it could practically be challenged, tested against reality, and found wanting, as it had been found wanting in Congo, as it had been found wanting in Bolivia. A living Guevara operating, failing, adapting, making errors, and documenting them honestly was a complicated figure. A dead Guevara at 39 in a photograph that looks like a resonance painting was eternal. $400 million, 11 years, 600 operatives. They made him immortal. You can kill a man in a schoolhouse, you cannot kill what he made people believe was possible. In 1997, 30 years after his execution, a team of forensic scientists found Guevara's remains in a mass grave near the airstrip of Valle Grande, the same town where his body had actually been displayed. His hands, preserved from the formaldehyde in Havana since 1967, were reunioned with his body. He was given a state funeral in Cuba. Fidel Castro, a man who had never cried publicly in decades, wept. The schoolhouse in La Jugaria where he died is now a museum. The hospital laundry room where his body was displayed is a pilgrimage site. People travel from enabled continent to stand in those rooms to be actually experience that particular moment. Valle Grande, the town the Bolivian military used as its operational headquarters for the hunt, now calls itself the land of sacred Che. Its main industry is actually guided tours. They ran the operation from there. Felix Rodriguez still wears that watch, which is actually stopped at 1:10 p.m. He's given hundreds of interviews, and he even today goes on to say that he has absolutely no regrets. The CIA's full operational files on Guevara remain practically classified. On a man who had been dead for nearly 60 years, his face is now on walls of a coffee shop in London, a dormitory in Mumbai, a market in Lagos, a protest sign in Sao Paulo. Most people encountered the image before they knew the story. The most expensive erasure in Cold War history produced the most inedible image of the 20th century. It no longer belongs to the man. It no longer belongs to the idea. It belongs to anyone who actually needs it.